A woman bullied Kanye West in public, because of his skin color, but his powerful response turned the shame back on her and silenced the entire crowd. On a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, the grocery store buzzed with activity. Kanye West, dressed casually in a hoodie and sneakers, strolled quietly through the store, blending in like any other customer. He moved with purpose, selecting items as he scanned the shelves. As Kanye reached for a loaf of bread, an elderly woman nearby noticed him. Her eyes narrowed, and her expression hardened. She muttered something under her breath, but it was loud enough for Kanye to hear. "You don't belong here," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the store's background noise. She wasn't finished. "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" she added, louder this time, ensuring that others around them heard. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The hum of activity in the store dimmed as people turned to look. Shoppers paused mid-step, their eyes darting between Kanye and the woman. A young mother steered her child away, while others stood frozen, unsure how to react. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others pretended not to notice the unfolding tension. Kanye stood still, his hand gripping the loaf of bread. His calm demeanor betrayed none of the emotions swirling within him. The elderly woman, clutching her shopping cart, looked at him with a defiant expression, as though daring him to respond. The silence grew heavier, stretching across the store. Even the soft hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade. Kanye took a slow, deliberate breath, gathering his thoughts. His calm yet powerful presence was impossible to ignore as he prepared to address the woman's shocking words. Kanye stood frozen for a moment, his hand still holding the loaf of bread. Her words hung in the air, sharp and loud, cutting through the usual hum of the grocery store. He blinked, visibly taken aback, and for a brief second, it seemed like he might not respond. The silence was heavy, as if the entire store had paused to take a breath. The elderly woman, however, wasn't done. She adjusted her cardigan and, with her chin lifted, doubled down on her remarks. "People like you think you can just come here and act like you belong," she said, her tone growing sharper. "This is our country, not yours." Kanye looked at her, his face calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of hurt and disbelief. He didn't say anything right away, and the pause made the situation feel even more intense. The woman's words seemed to echo in the quiet aisle, and the shoppers nearby could feel the weight of her hostility. People stopped what they were doing. A mother, holding her young child's hand, glanced over but quickly turned away, not wanting to get involved. A young man in a baseball cap stood near the frozen foods, watching with wide eyes, unsure of what to do. The cashier at the end of the aisle craned her neck to get a better view, her hands momentarily still on the register. Some shoppers whispered among themselves, their words barely audible over the tension. "Is that Kanye West?" someone murmured. "What's going on?" Kanye's calm presence stood in stark contrast to the woman's escalating tone. He didn't raise his voice or react with anger. Instead, he took a slow breath, his expression thoughtful as if deciding how to respond. The woman's words had not just targeted him, they had sent ripples through everyone within earshot, and the discomfort in the air was palpable. The crowd wasn't just watching Kanye, they were watching the moment unfold, the unspoken question on everyone's mind: how would he respond to this blatant hostility? Everyone knew something was about to happen, and no one wanted to miss it. Kanye stood there, the elderly woman's words echoing in his mind, but instead of reacting with anger or frustration, he took a deep breath. His hand released the loaf of bread, and he straightened his posture. His expression, though calm, carried a weight of quiet authority that seemed to command attention. The tension in the grocery store aisle was palpable, and the shoppers who had gathered couldn't look away. He took a step closer to the woman, his voice low but steady. "Ma'am," he began, "do you realize the impact of the words you just said?" The elderly woman, taken aback by his composed demeanor, didn't respond immediately. Her defiance faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her stance. "I said what I said," she snapped, her tone still sharp. "People like you don't belong here." Kanye didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "All right," he said, his voice still calm. "Let's talk about that. Let me tell you about where I come from." The store grew even quieter as he began to speak. His tone wasn't defensive, it was thoughtful, measured, and filled with conviction. "My great-grandfather," he said, "served in World War II. He fought for this country, even though when he came back, he wasn't treated like an equal. He wasn't allowed to sit at certain counters or live in certain neighborhoods. But he still believed in the promise of this country." He paused, letting the words sink in. The woman's face tightened, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was transfixed. A young man near the dairy section stopped scrolling on his phone, his full attention now on Kanye. A woman near the bread aisle nodded slightly, as if silently agreeing with his words. "My ancestors," Kanye continued, his voice growing more resolute, "endured slavery. They were taken from their homeland, beaten, sold, and treated as less than human. And yet, they helped build this country with their blood, sweat, and tears. They endured horrors you can't even imagine so that their children and their children's children could have a chance at a better life." The woman's lips tightened, her grip on her shopping cart trembling slightly. Kanye, noticing the shift in her demeanor, softened his tone but didn't lose his resolve. "And then there's my grandfather," he added, his voice quieter now. "He worked tirelessly in the civil rights movement, fighting for the freedoms that many of us take for granted today. He taught me to stand tall, to be proud of who I am, and to always treat others with kindness, no matter how they treat me." He took a moment to glance around, addressing not just the woman but everyone who was watching. "And me," he said, gesturing to himself. "I've worked hard to become who I am today. I've faced challenges, doubt, and prejudice, but I've turned those experiences into art, into music, and into opportunities to uplift others. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, but I didn't get here alone. My family, my community, they made this possible." Kanye's voice grew softer, carrying an empathetic tone that made the woman shift uncomfortably. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm not here to argue with you. I just want you to understand that words carry weight. They can build people up, or they can tear them down. And when we use words to divide, we only make the world a harder place for everyone." The woman's face flushed, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Kanye continued, his voice now filled with compassion. "I'm not angry with you," he said. "I just want you to see that we're all a part of this country. Every one of us has a story, a history, and a contribution. And if we stop seeing each other as different, and start seeing each other as human, maybe we can make this world a little better." The crowd around them was silent, many visibly moved by his words. A young woman near the cash register wiped a tear from her cheek. An older man with a baseball cap nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. The elderly woman looked down at her cart, her grip tightening on the handle. She opened her mouth as if to speak but hesitated. Kanye, noticing her discomfort, stepped back slightly, giving her space. "It's okay to feel uncomfortable," he said gently. "Change starts with discomfort. I'm just asking you to think about what you said and how it affects people." For a moment, the store was completely silent. Kanye stood there, his calm presence radiating a quiet strength. Then, slowly, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The woman didn't apologize, but her hardened expression softened slightly, and she nodded faintly before turning her cart and walking away. The crowd didn't clap or cheer, but their admiration for Kanye was evident in their quiet smiles and approving nods. Kanye picked up his basket, nodded politely to the onlookers, and continued his shopping. His words had left an undeniable impact, not just on the woman, but on everyone who had witnessed the moment. The grocery store was completely silent, the tension so thick it seemed to fill every aisle. Kanye West's calm but powerful words hung in the air, leaving an impact that couldn't be ignored. All eyes were on him and the elderly woman, who now stood gripping her cart tightly, her once defiant posture starting to falter. The confident, dismissive look she had worn moments earlier was gone, replaced by a mix of unease and confusion. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. Around them, shoppers who had been pretending not to notice were now fully engaged. Some exchanged glances, nodding quietly to each other, their expressions reflecting a shared understanding of what had just happened. A young mother with a toddler in tow stood frozen near the bread aisle, her eyes wide with both admiration for Kanye's composure and discomfort at the scene that had unfolded. An older man in the dairy section set down the milk he had been holding, his attention entirely fixed on the moment. The woman, still clutching her apples, shifted her weight uncomfortably. For a second, she looked around the store, as though searching for someone to back her up. But the crowd's collective mood had shifted entirely. No one stepped forward to support her. Instead, there was a growing sense of solidarity among the shoppers, a quiet but powerful acknowledgement of the truth in Kanye's words. It was a man in his 50s, standing near the dairy aisle, who finally broke the silence. He clapped once, slowly, deliberately. "He's right," the man said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We have to be better than this." His words seemed to open the floodgates. An older woman near the frozen foods aisle nodded in agreement. "My father fought in World War II, too," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." A young cashier, barely 20, stepped forward from her station. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with admiration. "I've never seen anyone handle something like this with so much grace." The murmurs of agreement grew louder as more people found the courage to speak up. A man in a baseball cap pointed toward Kanye. "What you said needed to be said," he declared, his tone filled with respect. "I don't know if I could have kept my cool like you did." The elderly woman's face turned crimson as the weight of the crowd's collective disapproval settled on her. Her grip on her cart tightened, her knuckles white. She glanced at Kanye, then at the crowd, her expression a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. She opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but no words came. The moment stretched on, and her resolve crumbled further. Feeling the pressure of the silent stares and the murmured affirmations directed toward Kanye, the woman finally took a step back. She adjusted her cardigan, her hands shaking slightly. Without another word, she turned her cart and began to wheel it toward the exit. Her defiance had evaporated, leaving only silence in its wake. The crowd watched her retreat, a mixture of emotions playing across their faces. Some looked relieved, others reflective, and a few even appeared sympathetic, as though they understood the internal battle she must have been facing. But no one stopped her. They let her go, the message having been delivered loud and clear. As the automatic doors closed behind her, the store slowly came back to life. The murmurs turned into soft conversations. People returned to their shopping, but the energy in the room was different now. It was quieter, more thoughtful. Kanye's words had left an undeniable mark, not just on the woman but on everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. A woman with a toddler walked over to Kanye, placing a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Not just for standing up to her, but for doing it the way you did. My son was watching. He's too young to understand everything, but he'll remember this." Kanye smiled faintly, nodding. "Sometimes it's not about what's said," he replied. "It's about how it's said. Anger builds walls, but grace can tear them down." Nearby, the young cashier who had spoken earlier added, "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us. That takes strength." Kanye shook his head humbly. "I just did what felt right," he said. "Sometimes, you have to speak up not just for yourself, but for the people who can't." The moment had passed, but its impact lingered. As Kanye finished his shopping, people nodded at him in quiet appreciation. Some even approached him to shake his hand or offer a few kind words. It wasn't about celebrity or fame in that moment. It was about courage, dignity, and the reminder that we all have the power to stand up for what's right. As Kanye left the store, the atmosphere had shifted. The shoppers who remained were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses to an act of quiet bravery, one that had sparked reflection and perhaps even change. And for the elderly woman who had left in silence, the weight of Kanye's words would stay with her far beyond the doors of the grocery store. The silence in the grocery store slowly lifted as Kanye West, his calm demeanor unwavering, glanced around at the crowd gathered near the produce aisle. The tension that had filled the air moments earlier had given way to a quiet sense of reflection. People stood still, their shopping forgotten, their expressions thoughtful. Kanye took a breath, his voice steady but filled with a gentle conviction as he addressed those who had witnessed the confrontation. "You know," he began, "it's easy to get caught up in our own worlds, to move through life without stopping to think about the power of our words and actions. But moments like this, these uncomfortable moments, are where change begins." His gaze swept over the crowd, landing briefly on the young cashier who had spoken up earlier, the man in the dairy aisle who had clapped, and the mother holding her child close. "We all have the ability to stand up for what's right, but it's not just about speaking out when we see wrong. It's about showing grace, leading with kindness, and reminding others that ignorance doesn't have to be permanent. People can change, but they need to see what change looks like." The crowd listened intently, his words resonating with them. Kanye's voice softened as he continued. "That woman who spoke those words today, she's not the only one who's ever thought like that, and she won't be the last. But the way we respond, with dignity and strength, can plant seeds. Seeds that might grow into understanding, into compassion." A few shoppers nodded in agreement, their expressions contemplative. The young cashier smiled faintly, as though Kanye's words were giving voice to thoughts she had always felt but never expressed aloud. Kanye shifted his tone slightly, now addressing the children in the store who had watched the events unfold. "To the young people here, let this be a lesson. You don't have to meet hate with hate. You don't have to fight fire with fire. You can stand tall, speak your truth, and still show respect. That's how we build bridges instead of walls." The weight of his words lingered, and for a moment, there was silence again, not an awkward silence, but one filled with thought and possibility. Kanye nodded gently, signaling that he had said all he needed to say. "Thank you for listening," he added. "And thank you for showing that there's more good in this world than hate." As he picked up his basket and turned to leave, the crowd seemed to part instinctively, their gazes following him as he walked toward the checkout line. A few people murmured words of thanks as he passed, and one man reached out to shake his hand, gratitude written all over his face. Later that evening, as Kanye sat in the quiet of his home, he reflected on the day's events. The confrontation had been unexpected, but it reminded him why moments like these matter. He thought about the elderly woman, the look on her face as his words had sunk in. He wondered if she was sitting at her own table now, replaying the encounter in her mind, questioning beliefs she had held onto for so long. Kanye smiled faintly, not out of pride but out of hope. He knew that change didn't happen overnight, but he also knew that every conversation, every act of courage, could make a difference. He thought about the young mother who had thanked him, the cashier who had spoken up, the man who had clapped. They were proof that people wanted to do better, to be better. They just needed a reminder of their power. As the night deepened, Kanye resolved to keep using his platform, his voice, to inspire these kinds of moments. He understood now more than ever that standing up against ignorance wasn't just about the person who spoke hateful words, it was about everyone who witnessed it. It was about showing the world what kindness, courage, and dignity looked like. Because in the end, moments like these weren't just about changing minds, they were about changing hearts. And that, Kanye thought, was how real progress began.